All right.
You have to give me permission to record you.
Oh, sorry. I will
Mhm.
do that. Um,
Please. Oh, Tim was saying with the document that it was the iPad that wouldn't allow him. It might he'll try back at school tomorrow.
okay. So we are ready to go.
Here we go.
Good. Well, everyone, welcome. My name is Eva de Gosztonyi. I'm the coordinator of the Center of Excellence, together with my colleague, Martine Demers, who is here. And I'm going to be sharing with you today the theoretical part of the presentation on trauma and the brain and understanding how trauma affects behavior and learning. And then we will have a second session in March where we will look at interventions, and Martine will be joining me probably more actively on that. Uh, so without
I'll need
further
to
ado,
stay quiet today, but watch out the next time.
exactly, exactly. Yeah, so I'm just going to share my screen here and just get started. And let me just tell you, this is quite the topic, quite the topic. I speak on it a lot as part of other presentations that I make. But today I'm going to be focusing more specifically just on the effects of trauma, the effects of what we call complex childhood trauma on behavior and learning. And I thought, oh, well, maybe I should just check a couple of more books or a couple of more articles. And oh my goodness, there is so much information out there. After I sent the handout, somebody wrote back to me and said, oh, did you check this person out? Did you check that person out? So I just want to let you know that this is as comprehensive as I could make it in the time that I have. In my next lifetime, maybe I'll devote myself to studying this in detail, but I hope that what I'm going to share with you will make sense to you. We have quite an array of people that are attending today. Some of the names I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I think you know more about trauma than I do, but thank you for attending. And I'm hoping that at the end of it, you'll have a sense of what it is that is happening with our children and why and how it affects their behavior and their learning. So it's really about trying to gain a perspective. The Center of Excellence for Behavior Management, our role is to support schools and school boards in understanding and working with children that have problems with their behavior. They disrupt classrooms, they make learning difficult for other people, they wear teachers and all the people that work with them, our technicians and our aides and our attendants, they wear them out. And we do everything we can to try and figure out how to help this child to manage their behavior in a way that doesn't impede their learning or the learning of other children. But we have changed over the years in our understanding of where behavior comes from. And it's really like an iceberg. What we see is the tip of the iceberg, but what we know is that underneath that iceberg, there's so much going on. And it is from that underneath part that the behavior manifests itself. And this is what I'm hoping to be able to share with you today is just a better of an understanding of where a behavior might be coming from, and sometimes why it's so difficult to change it. I did the presentation together with my colleagues in the French sector around this, and this made sense to me because there's a lot of work being done right now trying to make sure that we are teaching children as best we can. And I attended many, many sessions where people were talking about all the different ways that they could improve their practices for teaching. But my contention, I always came back to it, is that, if we don't understand what's happening inside of a child, then we aren't going to be able to intervene in a way that makes sense. And especially with children with behavior problems, if our interventions don't work, these kids aren't in class. If our interventions don't work, they aren't able to focus and pay attention. So while good pedagogical practices are essential, we actually need to be able to understand and intervene before we can engage them in the teaching learning process. Use a number of different sources, and as I say, this is not at all comprehensive. I know there's way more out there, but I was inspired initially by Regilina Melrose, who's an incredibly powerful speaker who brought this to my attention, that complex trauma is something that really affects children. Bruce Perry, who wrote a wonderful book that I read many, many years ago called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog and completely transformed my way of looking at things. Bessel van der Kolk, and all of these references are at the end of my presentation, but we will also be creating a page with these resources if they're not already on our website. Delphine Colin-Vézina from Quebec here, who does incredible work. Nadine Burke-Harris, who has a wonderful TED Talk, by the way. Peter Levine, Sonia Lupien, all of whom talk about trauma and the effect of trauma. The Australian Childhood Foundation that has developed incredible materials and just done a huge synthesis of how trauma affects children and all the ways that we can intervene to help them. And then, of course, the key study that seemed to switch people's brains onto this, which was the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. Of course, we always need to remember that children are also in the context of development and the human brain and how it develops. And so Jay Geed, Lauren Steinberg, and Ian McGilchrist have also had an effect on how I look at things. And I base everything on the developmental paradigm of Dr. Gordon Neufeld, where all of these things can be pulled in together. So it's kind of like an overriding way of looking at things. And why would we look at trauma now? Well, whole bunch of different reasons. I mean, one of it is that we are living through very challenging times right now. So some of us probably understand more clearly than ever before what some of these children might be going through. But children are continuing to struggle with their behavior. Schools are continuing to struggle. They're trying to do things that's not really working that well. There seem to be more of these children in our schools than ever before, but school boards' resources are limited. We can't just keep setting up another special class, another special class. We've got to find some other things that we can do within the resources that we have. And even within special classes, I just spent the afternoon before this talking to a number of people who are working with small groups, 6, 7 children with severe behavior problems. And even there, they're having challenges with the children. So there aren't always another there isn't another place to send our children, so we need to figure out what we can do within the resources that we have and within the parameters that we have to work with the children. How will this understanding help us? Well, we need to see the behavior differently. Again, when talking to the teachers, there was one little child who was incredibly unempathetic. The teachers moved heaven and earth to help this child. And then when they asked the child to do something to help them, he just looked at them and said, "That's not my business." And they were going like, "We did everything to help him. Why couldn't he help us?" I said, "Don't take it personally. Do not take it personally. It has to do with what is going on inside of him." What we see affects what we do. As I went through the profile of that particular child with those teachers, I could see them all of a sudden shifting their head from, "Oh, this is such a rude child. No one's taught him manners," to, "Oh, this poor kid, boy, is he ever struggling." And so we want to be able to intervene more effectively using what we call trauma informed responses. And the good thing about this is that if we use these responses, they're not only helpful to the children who are significantly affected by trauma, but also affected with all of the children in our school. And this is where next week Martine will share with you the things that she's doing in schools that are helpful to all of the children. And when we have better practices for managing behavior, we actually have better learning outcomes. Children's brains become more receptive to what it is that we are trying to teach them. So complex trauma, well, what's the prevalence of it? And again, there's studies, many, many, many studies, and it's really hard to kind of figure them all out because depending on what they're talking about, they're going to have different percentages. But anywhere between 20 to 30% of children have experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, and I'll get to what that is in a moment. When you have had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, you are going to have a lot more difficulties in your life. So 20 to 30%, that would mean out of any group of 20 kids, you maybe would have 4 or 5 or 6 or more, depending on the community that you are teaching in. And the effects, as Burke Harris, or Burke in this particular case, it's the same woman, but she uses her one name. She found in 2011 the increased risk for learning and behavior problems if you have 4 or more uh, adverse childhood experiences. So what is it? And again, there are many definitions out there, and I am going to talk about complex childhood trauma and adverse childhood experiences, kind of a little bit interchangeably. What we're meaning here is that there's an experience that a child has that can be measured somewhat, and it then has an effect on their behavior. So the Australian Childhood Foundation has come up with a very elegant one. It involves repeated relational harm, and I think this is the key point here. It really has to do as much with the fact that it is the adults in a child's life who are causing the difficulty. That comes from physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, or significant emotional or physical neglect, um, or family violence or other kinds of interpersonal violence. And it's directed at the infants and at the children by the very people that are meant to take care of them and protect them. And that is incredibly difficult on the development of a young child. The study that kind of was, I think, a trigger that kind of just turns people's minds to this whole idea, because complex trauma has been around for a long time. I've been in the field for over 45 years. We knew there were children who were struggling, but the ACE study kind of brought it to the fore. And it actually, the ACE study wasn't about looking at children with behavior problems or mental health problems. They were just trying to look, and it was an insurance company that just wanted to know who are some good bets of people that we can insure. And they looked at these San Diegans, so people who live in San Diego, good jobs, good healthcare, middle class people. They were not looking at, people that were living in some challenging circumstances. They were looking at the middle class people who should be doing well, and yet some of them got sick and some of them didn't. And how they came all around to this, I don't know, but they ended up realizing that there were 10 critical items that if they asked people about those items, and if people reported on having 4 or more of those items, it actually correlated with physical problems, but also with mental problems. And so they came up with these 10 adverse childhood experiences: emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, lack of family support, physical neglect, loss of a parent, witness to domestic violence, familial substance abuse, familial mental health, family member in prison. What shocked them was that with an ACE score of 4 or more, lung disease increased, hepatitis increased, depression increased, suicide increased, and that was just if you checked off 4 of them. If you checked off 6 of them, you had a hugely larger chance of becoming an IV drug user. And if you had a score of 10, you were likely to end up homeless, in prison for life, or death by suicide. And what they found was people with high ACE scores on an average died 20 years earlier than those with low ACE scores. Now, we aren't so interested in the physical problems. What we are interested in are the mental health problems that come with these things. And again, emotional abuse, it can be from a parent or from a sibling. Physical abuse, again, from a parent or a sibling. One of the cases we were looking at today, the physical abuse didn't come from the parents, but it came from unsupervised abuse by older siblings. Loss of a parent is not only a parent dying, it can be separation, it can be divorce, it can be a parent's absence. It can be a child who has had multiple step parents. So, in other words, they become attached to a boyfriend or a girlfriend and then that person leaves. The parent can be lost through illness. We had one mother that struggled for about 6 or 7 years with breast cancer. She was there physically, but oh my goodness, she was not able to be there for her children, and they kept thinking they were going to lose her, obviously through death and even adoption. It can be because the baby remembers the mother's voice, so already there's a loss there. So these are the kinds of things that can affect a child. Now, I've added some other ones to this because, of course, we're not part of a research study. We don't have to keep it to 10. And when I was consulting actually with this group of teachers that are dealing with children with quite severe behavior problems, these were some of the other things that they added in, which I thought, yes, these are things that will make a difference in a child's life. Frequent hospitalizations, either the parent or the child, where the parent and the child are either separated from each other or in alarm because of a prolonged illness. The death of a sibling, or having a sibling with special needs when parents are constantly having to go to the hospital, go to having a child who's in constant crisis because of their special needs, it can have a huge impact on the children, the other children in a family. As I mentioned, adoption, foster care. This is one of the things I always say to teachers. Make sure you know who the children are who are in foster care in your classroom, because they are going to be children affected by the trauma response. And any multiple changes in parental or guide or guardian care, and caregivers and parents who are at odds with each other. Sadly, when the adults in a family are not getting along, they say things to each other about the children that can completely affect the children. One case that we were looking at today, we're absolutely certain, and the teachers were pretty certain, that the grandmother basically told the mother that her having the baby, because the grandmother and the mother and the child were living together, that the mother had ruined her life. If it hadn't been for that child, her life wouldn't have been ruined. Well, this little girl heard that, and she felt this was hugely affecting her. What are the characteristics of an adverse childhood experience that can then cause complex childhood trauma? Well, it's really about separation, the loss or the possible loss of those to whom you are attached and who are meant to take care of you and protect you. And I created this term. I don't know if it's true, but what I can imagine is that it's a state of survival alarm. Either you have to work really hard at making sure they don't give up on you, or they actually weren't able to keep you safe and take care of you. And the brain can't handle that very well. It's chronic, it happens over time. The earlier that it's experienced, the more the child is going to be affected. And the more adverse childhood experiences that you have, the more likely the child is to have long-term effects. One of the cases we were dealing with, this child had been in special classes since he was in grade 1. I said, you're probably going to have him right through to grade 6, and he's probably going to have to go to a special high school because he has been so severely affected by the losses. It can have a greater effect on a child with high sensitivity. Sometimes we say, yeah, but those are great parents. It's a great family. That really wasn't a big thing that happened. But unfortunately, if the child comes to us with high sensitivity, it takes less to have an impact. And it can be modulated, but it can be modulated by caring attachments. All is not lost. We can do amazing things in our schools if we to compensate for what it is that the families can't do. When we look at this interaction, there are genetics, things like predispositions for ADHD or autism spectrum disorder or Tourette syndrome that come with our genetics, or there can be prenatal stressors, or there can be stressors at birth. So sometimes the child is brought to us in a very highly sensitive state, and then only the mildest separation or some sense of shame or some sense of alarm can trigger the complex trauma response in them. The effects of complex trauma, and I'm going to go over this very quickly and then I'll go through it in more detail. This is what we now know through the study of the physiology and the neurology of what happens in trauma. It is significantly alters the baseline physiological arousal levels in children. We have an amygdala that's kindled, releasing stress hormones into the body and brain, and that has a huge impact. It reduces the capacity of the brain, the cortical capacity to regulate the subcortical activation. In other words, the prefrontal cortex is hijacked by the emotional brain. So emotions take over. It disrupts memory functioning in children. So the hippocampus now, which is involved normally on transferring things from short-term memory into long-term memory, is now hijacked and focuses on survival and can't do its job. And it restricts the attentional capacity of children. When your emotional brain, when the limbic system is involved with survival, it's going to pay attention to what is a threat to survival and has a much harder a time paying attention to the things that we think in education are important. And again, I would say of the 6 children referred to me, 5 of them had attention problems. Well, that's exactly that. So let's just quickly look at the brain. And remember that we all have an amygdala that is basically like our smoke detector. It's right in the middle part of the limbic system. For whatever reason, it is able to detect any kind of threat to us. If your house, let's say you live on a street where trucks go by and your house starts shaking, your amygdala is going to say, is that something I need to worry about? Of course, if it happens all the time, it doesn't, but it always registers it. An alarm goes off, it registers it. It is sensitive to anything that can threaten a child or threaten us as human beings, and it's right next door to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus basically links the nervous system to the endocrine system via the pituitary gland. So, in other words, the amygdala says there's trouble, and the hypothalamus says, all right, body, let's get ready to be able to deal with trouble. And I'll show you what that is in a moment. And the three of them are all close together, so right by the hippocampus. And the hippocampus basically has two jobs. One job is to remember what is dangerous. And the second job is when all is going well, it transfers what we learn in our short term memory into our long term memory. And so for some of our children, when if they go home to an environment which is threatening to them, their hippocampus spends all night, all day, and all evening and all night, basically just trying to keep them alive and can't do the job. And that's why some kids will come back the next day and act as if they never heard what you were talking about, even though they had understood it the day earlier. Huge effects on learning when you can't consolidate your memories because your brain is not able to go into rest. What the hypothalamus does is it activates the sympathetic nervous system, which is our system of activation, and it puts cortisol, adrenaline, norepinephrine, and growth hormone right into our system, which then gives us the energy to pay attention, to notice things, to focus on what's important to the norepinephrine. You know, many teachers will say to me, I don't understand. He's just noticing every little thing. He can't seem to shut stuff out. Well, exactly, because when we are in a heightened state of activation, we want to notice all those things. Many of you maybe can remember back to the early part of the pandemic when you were worried about, did I wash my hands enough? Is that person far enough away from me? Do they have a good enough mask on? Is their mask above their under their nose or above their nose? That's the norepinephrine that was helping you to notice things that you never paid any attention to before, right? You notice somebody coming down the sidewalk, and so that you could go to the other side. These particular hormones allow us to pay more attention to an environment and to do what we have to do to keep ourselves safe. The only thing is, if you have too much of these in your system for too long, you either get very sick or you get very tired because they are meant to go up and down. And again, through the pandemic, we've realized what it feels like to be in this constant state. And as a result, we have constricted blood vessels. We don't feel like eating so much. We have a sharp increase in breathing and heart rate, and we have the blood diverting to the muscles. By the way, eating, a little bit tricky because for some of us, our survival response is to eat more so that we can have energy to be able to do things. For some of us, our stomach shuts down. I know for myself, I'm in really high alarm when my stomach shuts down. Most of the time, when I'm in alarm, my body wants to eat and fuel itself. So it's a little bit of an interesting thing. Just another way of looking at this, just so that we understand how much the survival system of our brain, the emotional part of our brain, is there and essential for us. Just use the example of a snake, and some of you might not even be able to look at this picture because we are wired as human beings to be quite frightened of snakes. Basically, the eyes just take in the fact you're going for a walk and you see something kind of coiled up. So the eyes just take in the fact that it's coiled up, and they bring it to the visual thalamus. Now, the visual thalamus is it's one of the picture of a snake is one of the last pictures that we're able to identify even after they've been grayed out. That's how wired we are to be worried about snakes, because snakes, of course, can be lethal. So the visual thalamus basically says, this kind of looks like a snake, amygdala. You better get ready. And the amygdala immediately starts, and the hypothalamus starts pumping the things for us to be careful. Even if you're an experienced person in the woods, you see something that resembles a snake, and you're at least going to stop for a moment because your whole system says this could be danger. Now, meanwhile, let me just go back here. Meanwhile, it's also sending a message to the visual cortex, which basically says, is it really a snake? Does it have a head? Does it have a tail? Could it be a snake? Is it winter? All sorts of things. So it's starting to figure out whether it really is a snake or not. And then it sends a message to the cortex, which says, nah, it's winter time. There's no such thing as snakes in the winter time. And then it also sends a message to the prefrontal cortex, because if you're a teacher and you're going on a walk and you see a snake, you might be able to run away, but you got to also protect your kids. So your prefrontal cortex says, even though you feel like running away, don't run away right now because you got to protect your kids. So you can see how what happens first is the limbic system gets into action. And just to give you an example of how this worked, I knew a lady who was about my age and about my size. She had her two grandchildren with her at a camping ground. She was very, very afraid of snakes. She saw a little tiny garter snake come by. Some of you know me, I'm at the age and of the size where I no longer leap. This woman, who is she leapt onto the picnic table because her emotional brain basically said, protect yourself, protect your children, get up there. When she got up to the top of the table, and then she said, oh my goodness, I don't want to give these kids, a phobia about snakes, but how am I ever going to get down? Her prefrontal cortex kicked in. Luckily, a young man noticed her distress and came and saved her. But the limbic system gets into action before the cortex. And then we have to ask ourselves, what is it that is the biggest threat to children? Just some other little things that we need to remember, especially when we're thinking about behavior, is that reacting to a threat, the first thing we do is refreeze. And in that moment, we are actually looking to see, is there anyone that can save us? And we're going to talk about other emotions that come up when we have a threat, but pursuit is one of them. Is there someone that can save us? And if we look around, the alarm goes off, and then someone says, okay, everybody out this door, away we go. If there's nobody around to tell us what to do, our first response is flight. People got it wrong. It's not the fight or flight response, it's the flight response. First, we want to flee. We want to move to caution because in alarm, we just think, okay. And a lot of our kids go into flight. They run out of the classroom, they hide under desks, they basically put their head down. They don't want to do anything because they're basically trying to keep as safe as possible. One little girl we were talking about, it was basically if she didn't do any work, she couldn't get into trouble. So she was, avoiding work because it made her feel safe. Now, if we're trying to get out of a room, and any of you have had worked with difficult children know that sometimes if they're trying to get out of the room and we block them, now they go into fight because now we're frustrating their ability to save themselves and now they start attacking. Now, some children have this response going on so much and with such intensity that ultimately actually their brain can't handle it anymore and then it numbs out. And so some of these kids look like nothing bothers them anymore, but it's actually what we call defensive detachment. The brain is defending itself against an emotion that is too much to bear. And Bessel van der Kolk, in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, they were able to visually look at brains that were numbing out information. I thought defenses were a psychological term, but they're actually neurological as well. So what we now have found, and again, I'm quoting research that I'm most familiar with, but this research is there's other information about this as well. But McCrory said that children exposed to family violence, they were looking at brain patterns, and they were also looking at people that they knew had had post-traumatic stress disorder, which were soldiers exposed to combat, right? So they wanted to say, okay, what's going on here? How does this work? So what they found was when they looked at the brain at what was happening, and what they did was the activity was you showed a picture of an adult with an angry face. So it was just a picture. What they found was that these children who had been exposed to family violence, they had and the soldiers both had an increased brain activity in the amygdala. And as I say, it was just when they were shown pictures of angry faces. Some of you might say, "Oh my goodness, we don't even know why this child got upset." And I had a case like that of a little boy who loved phys ed until one day he hated phys ed, and we were trying to figure out why. Well, the phys ed teacher had to reprimand somebody else in the class, and that was enough for him. Because we call this a kindled amygdala. Okay, the amygdala fires as though danger is always imminent. And that's why you get the rapid escalation coming out of the blue. We don't even know what we did. We don't know what happened. Well, for that child, the smallest thing can cause them going from mildly anxious to feeling threatened to feeling terrorized out of the blue. And inside of their body, it feels as if someone is going to hurt them. If any of you have ever had a panic attack, or if you ever know anyone with a panic attack, this is what they say happens. It's like their whole body overreacts to the most simplest kind of thing. And so it does change the brain. And as I say, it can be a searing trauma or it can be prolonged exposure to chronic stress or fear, which is what we're talking about when we're talking about adverse childhood experiences. And the threat is seen everywhere and it affects the memory and the learning because, as I mentioned before, the brain requires rest in order to consolidate what is learned. And so when with these children, they basically everything, they react to everything. A kid can just kind of make a joke and they react to it as if the child had hit them. They become hypervigilant. Their focus is on the nonverbal because, of course, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. That's very, very important. Again, this teacher, this phys ed teacher, who apparently was a marvelous phys ed teacher, did lots of fun play activities with the little ones. But unfortunately, she had to raise her voice. And for that little boy, that raising of the voice basically just put him into a panic moment. Body language, facial expression, because they're looking at all of these things. Are you going to be a danger to me? And it's the nonverbal. As we know, 85% of human communication is nonverbal, and the rest is the 15%. And tone of voice is all part of that. And the language part of the brain actually shuts down. If any of you have ever been pulled over, and I remember when I first came to Quebec and I was pulled over by a police officer and he started talking to me. At that time, my French wasn't very good and I was in high alarm, couldn't understand a word he said, even though my French was pretty good, because my alarm actually disactivated the verbal part of my brain, the language part of my brain. So these children become beings of sensation. Now, there was another study that was done at the same time, and I don't not sure if these researchers put the pieces together, but luckily they came out around the same time, and it really helped me to put the pieces together. So this was adolescents on the self-reported trauma questionnaire, and they were looking at physical abuse, physical or emotional neglect, and what they found was that the children who had reported more of the abuse or the neglect had a decrease in the volume of the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is a complex part of our brain. But for the males, it was around impulse control, and for the females, it was around impulse regulation. And so Jakowski, so it basically the emotional regulation was not there. Jakowski also noticed that PTSD reduce the volume of the corpus callosum. So the prefrontal cortex allows us to have mixed thoughts and mixed feelings, suppress our impulses, have response flexibility, delay gratification, time management, the ability to work, all those wonderful things that provide a tempering element and that allows us to apply what we know. We call them executive functions. That part of the brain is not as well developed. The corpus callosum has the connection between the two hemispheres of the brain. It allows us to integrate information, and very, very briefly, we need both hemispheres of our brain. Our left hemisphere has the knowledge, the details, the facts, but it doesn't have the context. The right hemisphere of our brain actually looks at the whole picture, the context, makes vivid and concrete, takes in the whole picture. For our brain to function well, we have to be able to get our knowledge, put our knowledge into context, bring it back. So many children, for example, will use swear words, and we say that's not an appropriate place to use swear words. Couldn't you remember? Well, if that corpus callosum isn't working very well, it's not making that connection. The thing about the right hemisphere is that it requires experiences, not information to develop. And some of our children, because of what they were living, they don't actually have a chance to really explore their world to create a robust right hemisphere. And so sometimes they have lots of pieces of knowledge, but they can't make sense of it. So what we have here is we have a kindled amygdala where emotion is heightened, and which we can call hot cognition, and then we are part of the brain that's supposed to kind of bring in the reason, and the cold cognition is actually decreased. So the compromised prefrontal cortex and corpus callosum functioning, that is not going as well. So in other words, you overreact and you don't have the capacity to basically temper that or to calm it or to stop yourself so that you don't get into trouble. And I call this the double invisible handicap. So many of these children, if they had a physical handicap, we'd have so much more empathy for them. These kids sound smart, but they keep getting themselves into trouble because of what's going on inside of their brains. It's functional at the time. In other words, the flight or fright response makes sense, but it can cause problems in the school setting when the kid keeps running away, or when they keep avoiding doing work, or when they keep attacking those who are, especially when we are just trying to make them do something that is in their best interest. And the hypervigilance, of course, means it's really hard for them to stay on task. They have scattered attention, they can't remember instructions, and they can't get their work done. It limits their ability to have response flexibility. The cortisol kind of makes the brain kind of rigid. It's focusing on survival. Even though they know better, they can't do better because they can't access the higher parts of their brain. And as I say, the cortisol is detrimental both to the development of the prefrontal cortex and to the corpus callosum. So they have a brain that is not as functional or effective as a normally developing child. What happens is emotion, instinct, cognitive capacity, integrative capacity, these are all supposed to work together. But when we go into danger and survival mode, basically emotion and instinct to take over. Um, it disconnects children from relationships that can mitigate its effects. Unfortunately, well, let alone the fact that the adults who are supposed to take care of the child aren't doing that. But then their behavior can alienate children, alienate the adults who are taking care of these children. Because what if a child knows better but just continually refuses to do better? What's wrong with them? What if the child turns on you? Attacks the people they love the most, which sometimes can happen. What if we're doing everything we can and not only isn't getting better, it seems to be getting worse? It also affects identity formation in children, and of course, it has a huge effect on their social skills and isolates them from their peers. Of course, when we are dealing with that, then the kind of typical interventions that we have, reasoning and talking, consequences, none of these things actually help because talking keeps them in a high arousal. When they're in survival mode, they can't hear our words, they can't process our language, they feel the intensity of the moment, and really many of them are just listening, hoping and praying that you won't say, and I've had it with you. And so they really can't respond to the interventions that work with our well functioning children. So the other thing that we need to understand is that when children are facing separation, the brain is moved to fix the problem. We call this emotion. And there's three big emotions that happen when we're facing separation. One of them is pursuit. We want to restore proximity. We want to please people. This is often why we have a honeymoon period when a new person comes into a classroom or a child comes into a new situation, or what happened after COVID. The kids came back for after being away. Oh, they just wanted to please everybody. But when you are facing separation, you also have a high amount of alarm, and you are also moved to caution and to be careful and to avoid what alarms. Again, most of us felt this. Oh my goodness, were we ever avoiding everything? We weren't touching anything anymore because that's what we do when we're alarmed. Because, of course, if you got COVID, you could be facing separation. But there's also frustration because when you are facing separation, you want to fix that separation. And if you can't fix that separation, then you're moved to attack. What's important here is that these motions are usually intense and felt one at a time. And so, but they can displace each other. So when you're trying to please someone, like when your child is visiting at grandma's house and is being really, really good for grandma, but grandma isn't, cutting the bread the way they should or making them drink the juice with the little bits in it, like my daughter, or sort of thing. So there's frustration there, but they're trying to please grandma. And so while they're trying to please grandma, they're good as gold. You come and pick your child up. You say the least little thing to frustrate them. They have a huge meltdown, and your mother in law looks at you like, what did you do wrong? She was perfectly fine for me. But what we don't realize is that the frustration was there all the time. It just didn't manifest itself. And again, sadly, for some of us at schools, when we're doing well at dealing with children, their frustration that they hold together at home comes out for us, and sometimes vice versa. Now, sometimes when you can't fix a separation problem, you start getting locked into certain kinds of behaviors. One of the children that we were talking about today wanted to win all the time. He figured if I win all the time, then people are going to love me. Some of us get stuck in anxiety and alarm, and anxiety is when we can't talk about what alarms us. And so we get agitated, we have obsessions, we have compulsions, we do anxiety reducing kinds of behaviors, rocking and so on, because the alarm is so big and we just can't fix it, but we still have the agitation of alarm inside of us. Or with the frustration, it comes out in tantrums, hostility, aggression, and possibly self-attack. What's important here to remember is that these things can appear one at a time and can cycle around. And so this is why some of these children are so confusing to us, because one little boy I remember was wonderful for the language arts teacher because it was a man. And so he was in pursuit, wanted that man to really like him. But as soon as he came back to his regular classroom teacher, who was a woman, oh my goodness, the frustration just came out. And she said, "What did I do wrong?" "You didn't do anything wrong. This is the way it works." This was a child who had many, many other problems, and he was always worried about his parents being upset with him. It's that iceberg that's there. The emotions are underneath, like alarm, the adrenaline, the cortisol are going there. Now, one of the things I need to alert you to the fact is that an emotion is not the same as a feeling. A feeling is when we can name what is going on in our emotional world. And for alarm, the biggest name for that is I'm scared. If during COVID your children were able to say, "Miss, what if I get sick? I'm scared of getting sick." That's not a mental health problem. That's not anxiety. That's alarm being expressed. But sometimes we can get overwhelmed. It's too much for us to say, too much for us to feel, too much to us talk about it. Some of the children we were talking about today, what they really are alarmed about is, what if my mommy and daddy don't want to take care of me anymore? Well, you can't deal with that. And so our brain protects us, but it just means that now we can't talk about the emotional world that's going on inside of us. And why does our brain protect us? Well, when we feel too vulnerable or when we feel too wounded. So what happens here is that there's more emotion but less feeling. And that is actually the experience of stress. That's what many of us were experiencing when COVID first hit. Well, maybe even some of you right now, because you're constantly having to do your job, but also worried about catching the virus. And so, unless you can have lots of ways of expressing your emotions and getting back and being able to talk with people about how scared you feel, you're going to experience that as stress. And what happens then is behavior comes out. Things like inattention, agitation, hyperactivity, poor memory, fatigue, numbness, obsessions, compulsions, and panic attacks when we can't talk about what's really going on inside of us. Similarly, when we look at frustration, the feeling for frustration is, this is not working. Something needs to change. And boy, I bet most of us had that feeling. And if we were able to name it, then we were in touch with our emotions. But again, sometimes our brain protects us. We have more emotion and less feeling, and then the behaviors come out. The impatience, the abruptness, the rudeness, the irritability, the physical outbursts, the tantrums, the fatigue, and the depression. In effect, what's happening here is emotions are overwhelming. The brain kind of closes the door. It says emotions are hard at work right now. So the internal feedback, we have to wait a while to process our feelings, but please come back later and don't wait too long. And this is the mistake that we make because some of our kids look like not much is bothering them. The behaviors that they show us are different. Like some of the easiest children to deal with are the ones that keep saying, "Oh, I'm worried, I'm worried, I'm worried." I mean, we think they're in the most distress, but they're at least talking about what worries them. The kids who look like everything's okay, but then the agitation comes out, the inability to pay attention comes out. We need to be talking to those children about what is happening in their emotional world. In effect, what happens if there's too much separation, too much shame, too much alarm, basically the shell goes on, but as a result, development doesn't happen. And the shell goes on because it's not safe. It's not safe to express what I'm feeling. It's not safe to depend or be vulnerable, or the world is so overwhelming and there's nobody who can keep me safe. And again, one of the children we were talking about, teachers were worried this child has no empathy. No, because everything he's gone through, all of the ways in which people were not able to take care of him, his brain basically said, I have to take care of myself. I don't have the luxury of even thinking about other people. And how sad is that? How sad is that when your brain is so convinced that you have to take care of yourself? And of course, that can cause huge problems because a child who doesn't have empathy can become a bully, and now they're even in more trouble. So they lose playfulness, restfulness, vulnerable feelings, and playfulness, fun, joy, all of those feelings actually go missing with children like this. They have huge immaturity. We were talking about a 12-year-old little girl who was more like a 5-year-old. We were talking about a 9-year-old that was more like a 3-year-old. And we're not talking about intelligence here. We're talking about the other parts of development we often call emotional intelligence. the capacity to be able to, to have a brain that does all the things that it's meant to do. And when that shell is on, it doesn't do that. Less flexibility. Now they become rigid. They do things in the same way all the time and they don't seem to learn from their mistakes. They lose their empathy and their caring. And then they get more wounded because people around them just don't understand why they're like that and they're trying to fix them. And there's all sorts of other problems that come with it that we really don't have time to deal with today. The other thing which happens is when you have that shell on you, you don't have the ability to heal, to recover, to bounce back. When we look at the interventions, one of the main big intervention that's going to make a huge difference for a child is the ability to find their sadness and their tears. For all of us, bouncing back from this pandemic is actually dependent on our ability to find our sadness and our tears. And when we have that shell around us, we risk losing the people that try to take care of us. And again, I mean, all of you are amazing in what you're willing to do for the children in your care. But sometimes it gets too much when that child basically pushes us away and doesn't seem to get better. The bottom line is, though, that when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. We have to be the gardeners. We have to create an environment in which the growth and development that was stunted can start up again. And then in the developmental approach, we believe that every one of us has a chance, given the right circumstances, to grow and develop again. So, what we're going to talk about in our next session, which is about a month from now, so I didn't want to leave you hanging too much, is I'm going to just give you some of the guiding principles of what we're going to look at in terms of ways of intervening children who've experienced these kinds of a complex childhood trauma or adverse childhood experiences. Um, One of them is the main one, of course, is to create a safe world for the child. And again, I have to give all of our schools in the entire province of Quebec huge kudos because in the conditions of the pandemic, your children are feeling incredibly safe. I see things on Facebook. I see all the activities that you do. The children in our schools would not be able to engage in those activities if they didn't trust you. And that's our role as adults. But for some of these children, we have to work even harder at making them believe that we will keep them safe. So we need to make sure that we keep adult-child relationships strong. Don't let the behavior cause divisions. Don't take it personally. Remember, sometimes I remember one of my teachers said, I don't understand, Eva. This little guy, he comes off the bus. It's the morning. I've, and completely let bygones be bygones. He comes off the bus. I say, Hi, honey. How are you? I'm so happy to see you. He comes off the bus. She says, I hate you. You're stupid. She said, What did I do wrong? I said, Absolutely nothing. The home that he comes from gives no space for his emotions. He's just been on the bus where he was probably being bullied, and he just needed to let you know his world wasn't going very well, but he didn't do it very politely. Don't take it personally. At the end of the day, find ways to reassure the child that even if it's been a difficult day, I'm looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. That is gold to a child. I remember one of the children, Martine, that we dealt with. He got sent home at noon, right? And of course, we sent him home at noon because no adult could hang on to him till the end of the day. But when he left at noon, everybody said, Oh, we're looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. And I remember the mom coming back and saying, How come you always tell the child you're going to be happy to see him? I know he hasn't been able to be good for you. Oh, no, but in half a day, we could do that. And he was eager to come back to school the next day. We need to minimize the experience of separation, and we're going to do something that's going to be a little bit difficult to hear. We're going to analyze often used interventions for hidden sources of separation. Sometimes we don't realize that our best intentions are actually making things worse. So hang on to your hats next week. We need to compensate for the effects of trauma, the overreactivity, the immaturity, so that children can behave successfully. And it was very interesting because, again, I was talking to a group of teachers who have they've got 4 different classrooms. All of the children there are children with complex trauma. Don't do very well at recess time because there's way too many kids and way too much stuff going on and way too many strangers. And many of them have decided to keep 2 or 3 of the children in at recess time. Keep them out of trouble. Keep them close to them. provide options for them when they're overwhelmed, and anticipate and prevent. And we're going to give you all sorts of ideas of how you can anticipate and prevent problems so that the trauma complex doesn't make things worse for the child. We need to provide structure and predictability, and I know many of you are fantastic at that. It's not easy to do, especially when from day to day we keep being told that things are going to be different. But again, within that, we try and provide that so that children can count on us and know what they can count on. And by the way, the biggest predictability is that as the adults, every morning when we see the children or every time we see the children, we let them know we are happy to see you. A child needs the consistency of knowing that the adults are there for them. So if you can't keep everything else constant, at least keep your desired and permission to have that child exist in your present constant for them. Obviously, you need to build a team of interveners. Oh my goodness. There's no way that we can do it ourselves. Use the adult resources in the school creatively, and Martine has some wonderful ideas for that. And then offer a variety of intervention options. Provide safe spaces in the classroom. One of the classrooms had a spot where a little girl could go. She could play with things that calmed her down. She had a chance, she could draw pictures if she needed to get some of her emotions out. That worked very, very well in the classroom. Some children need to go somewhere else in the school, a nurturing support center, and we'll share a little bit about what that is. And some children actually need a safe place to express their emotions. And in some of our schools, we've created emotions rooms where some of the really foul frustration can come out. The hitting, the throwing, even the spitting can happen in a room where it isn't going to violate or hurt anybody else. And then ultimately, of course, we want to soften the defensive armor through emotional expression and play. And both of those things are important. We need to help the children to find their tears, and because some of our children can't talk to us about what's happening to them, it's too overwhelming, they can play it out. And again, I just loved the sensitivity of these teachers. They said, we know this little boy is living lots of difficult, frustrating things. He's got a lot of foul frustration in him. And he cuts up his erasers and then he plays with these little guys and they're fighting with each other. They said, is it okay? Because we know he needs to get it out. Absolutely. Play lets children provide. And again, we won't have time next week to talk a whole lot about play, but we actually have a couple of really good recordings on our website. So our next event is on the 16th of March. Many of you have already signed up. Please sign up if you haven't. And remember, if you sign up and can't come, we will send you the recording of that session as well. Don't forget to visit our website. We have all sorts of information on our website under projects, we don't even have I'm sorry, I didn't put the coronavirus tag. We have lots of stuff under coronavirus, lots and lots of resources that have been built by myself, by Martine, and by our other colleague, Catherine Cora. And then some trauma resources here. I think I already have them on the website as well, and we'll be developing more of those. Whew, there we go. I will stop sharing my screen. And
Great job there, Eva. That was quite the trek. You took us on a whole adventure. Okay, let's see if we have some questions. Please put them in the chat.
So I haven't sent out the link yet for the for the presentation on interventions that we will send out in a little while.
The next presentation is actually in March. Eva mentioned next week because we often do things like every week.
I say next week?
Yeah,
sorry.
But it's next month. So it's March.
Yeah, March 16th. Yeah.
So March.
If you go
16th,
on our website, you'll see it there.
If you go on our website, you'll see the link there that you can click to register there. You can do that right away if you want.
Okay, I see a question there. Should the homeroom teacher take charge of realizing all the things traumatized children need? No, and that's why it's so important for there to be a team. Now, one of the big questions that came up when we did this presentation for my French colleagues was, does a child need a diagnosis? And do we need to know all the things that are wrong with the child? And again, sometimes we can know. I mean, if you have a child who's in foster care, clearly that's a child with a trauma, adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. But a child who's chronically not responding to the regular interventions that work well with children is probably a child who's had too much. And then you need to have your team, your resource teacher, your special ed technician, your behavior consultant. your special education, whoever you can in your school that can help you to find a way to help this child through the day, make it through the day.
One of the questions, Eva, maybe a few examples on the hidden sources of separation, just to give a little bit more of a window there for people.
Well, I don't know if you're referring to what we were talking about in terms of intervention. Yes, again, for example, and we've had this habit of sending home at the end of the day a little evaluation of how the child's day went. In fact, so much so that some of our agendas now have these little red face, yellow face, green faces, and you just tick off what kind of day the child has had. And again, sadly, when a child gets a red face, it actually causes separation because, first of all, the child has to bring home to the parent the message they didn't have a good day. And so imagine if you had like not a great day at work and your boss gave you, you say, now you got to bring home to your spouse this little ticket that shows you didn't have a good day. I mean, most of us, even if we get like a speeding ticket, we don't want to tell our spouse because we don't want to see the look of disappointment in their eyes. Right. So again, I'll analyze that and go through it. But we have some of these kinds of practices that we think help behavior, but actually they don't. I also have a couple of articles on that. I'll post those. What I will do is I'll post some of the articles that I've already written right on our front page, so you can download those and read more about these hidden sources of separation if you're eager ahead of time. And I'm really sorry because these are practices that we all use but sadly, I know for me, when I finally realized them, I felt really guilty because I had been recommending those for years for people to use. I haven't now for the last 15 years, or 20 years, but I didn't realize what it was doing to the parent-child relationship.
Mm-hmm. Eva, do you have some suggestions for students who have a mild intellectual handicap, but also have adverse childhood experiences?
Well, see, ironically, a lot of people tend to separate those things out and they deal with either one or the other, but it's the same thing. And when we look at the interventions, we're basically saying when the child shows us through their behavior that things are not working for them, what can we as an adult do to help things work better for them? I mean, we all have kind of a zone of functioning, right? You know, and as adults, the thing is that most of us can keep ourselves in that zone, and so we always want to pull a child to do a little more than they think they can do. But when a child is starting to kind of fall apart, what we basically need to say to ourselves is his system is overloaded. It is too much for him. And many of you do it naturally. I watch teachers in classrooms. A child is starting to do this. Teacher just swoops over and goes, honey, do you want me to help you? Can I show you what to do next? Child calms down, away they go. Now, the trouble with traumatized children is they don't give us enough time to even get over to their desk. Some of them react. And that's where you need your team to say, okay, I know that some of our children, for example, have a really hard time in music and phys ed and French. Some of these kinds of sessions are really hard for them. We just talked about a little boy that could handle music for 10 minutes. Well, it took a while for them to realize that 10 minutes was what he could do. So after 10 minutes, they had to give him another option. It's not always easy to find another option, but instead of him constantly getting into trouble, what can we do to help him stay out of trouble?
Mm-hmm. So we have a comment, Eva, that if we're understanding correctly, that we don't need to have the whole family history to deal effectively.
No,
And that some families, they're reluctant to reveal about what's happened in the past, but we don't need to have all of the details and all of the information to be able to intervene and be supportive and help that student make headway.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think any child who has difficulty with their behavior, whether it is acting out or actually unmotivated, I would just say there's something that is overwhelming that child. It's too much for them. And what can we do to help?
This might be a good one to kind of close us up today, Eva. And it'll really leap us into next time when we meet in March. A child is demotivated, falls asleep in class, states that he's bored, does not like school, can seem, and it's hard to seem to connect with a student. Tried putting a reward system in place to motivate student to go to school, participate, etc., but does not seem interested. Suggestions,
Yeah.
but even just the flow of it, I think, would be
Well,
a good
yes,
way
and
to kind of segue today.
Yeah, and I think basically what the child is basically saying is, I am completely overwhelmed by absolutely everything. And so we need to start from the basics, which is every day just to be happy to see the child. I'm glad you came today. I'm happy that you're here, you know, and let's see what we can do to make the day pleasant for you. And we have to really sometimes let go of many of our expectations so that we can keep that child. But this child is a quite an extreme case because when the brain shuts down that much, it's overwhelmed by too much. Again, we
Mhm.
only had an hour to cover a very, very complex topic. I will post a couple of, I have one booklet that came from the Australian Childhood Foundation. It's about 30, I can't remember how many pages, 35 pages, so print it off at school. And you can read more and more about kind of all the things that I talked about today. And there are some suggestions for interventions there as well. Oh, I
Good
think
job.
I actually think what we're probably going to do is we will next month talk about interventions, and then after that, maybe even set up a time for looking at some case studies. So a third session where we apply the theory, the
Mhm.
practicalities, and see
'Cause
how
we
we can analyze a situation about what might be influencing a child's behaviors.
'cause we could go from that, even we help guide or map out some possible intervention avenues of different things that could be tried within, at school.
Yeah, yeah,
Having a range of things. But I think one of the things, if we can close on this, I think one of the biggest things is any student, any child who has lived through trauma is not a teacher or one adult at school should be holding the weight of that student. I call them heavy students, but in a very warm sense of we need to share the weight. We need to have a team because it can be quite taxing, and we do need to be able to tag team off each other so that we can maintain, like Eva was saying, that desire to, I'm happy to see you tomorrow, and even if today was like, oh man, what a day, and we can say, but tomorrow is a new one, and I'm looking forward to seeing you, and we're going to do this together. And that leap, and sometimes it can be very taxing, and we need to have that other people to do that, so that if we're not feeling it so intensely on a given moment, is we know that others have also stepped in and been part of that. So it's almost like they have a welcoming committee. Not that we want to overdo it, but we share the weight. And I think there's great comfort in that, because we also get to see the little steps of progress that sometimes when we're getting tired, we don't pick up on, we don't notice them, but somebody else in another context in that day may have noticed something, and how good it feels to, oh, I'm happy we caught that. That was an effort. That was a sense of release, or a child that was able to find a little bit of rest with somebody. That's huge. So it helps to hold the spirit and to sustain energy, especially in times that are challenging. So I think that, for people to know that you're not expected to hold it alone, and please do seek out your team. I think people having conversations together will be the best way through. And with this information, I hope it helps to guide, provide some more avenues, and we'll see you in a month.
yes. Thank you, Martine. Lovely summary. And all the best, everybody. Keep well.
The recording will be sent. Some people are asking. The recording will be sent to everybody that had signed up. It will also be available on our website. So either of places, and you can feel free to pass it on to share with any colleagues, people that you know that you feel could benefit from this information. Please do so. And any of the resources on the CBM website, you're welcome to share with people also.
Exactly.
I'd